Hello, everybody. Hello, and welcome back to A House Divided, coming to you live from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it's on our shelves, it's history. My name is Bjorn Skaptason, and my job is to administer the event for you today. This event we're doing today is going to be an interview with the author of The North Star, Julian Sher. Now, Daniel will introduce you to Julian in just a moment. Ready to talk about the North Star? Ready to talk about Canada and the U.S. Civil War and the plot against Lincoln? Therefore, let me introduce you to your host for this program, Daniel Weinberg of Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. Daniel.
Thank you, Bjorn. Greetings to everyone on this 100-degree day here in Chicago. And we're in some sort of air conditioning here, so that helps not only us, but the books. So you'll get a book that's in good shape. Let me introduce this, of course, is A House Divided, and we're here at the broadcast studio in the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. And hopefully soon we'll actually have the authors back here next to me. So it's a little bit more of the interview style we like. Well, Julian Sher is an award-winning journalist. He's a senior fellow at Toronto Metropolitan University's Center for Free Expression. He works with Journalists for Human Rights. He's been an investigative reporter for both the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail. He was a senior producer of Canadian Broadcasting Company's The Fifth Estate. He's directed and written major documentaries covering wars and intrigue. His documentary, Nuclear Jihad, produced for the New York Times and the CBC, won the broadcasting equivalent of a Pulitzer Prize. He produced the award-winning 2021 film, Ghosts of Afghanistan. He's the author of 7 books, including White Hoods, Canada's Ku Klux Klan. He's the author of 2 books on biker gangs, The Angels of Death and The Road to Hell, and the author of 2 books on crimes against children, One Child at a Time and Somebody's Daughter. His latest book delves into historical events, The North Star, Canada and the Civil War Plots Against Lincoln. It's a Knopf Canada production, 465 pages and illustrated. It's $28 in the United States, $38 in Canada. As our friend, many of you know Ed Steers, we've had him on our show, points out that this book covers the role of Canada played in providing sanctuary to elements of the Confederate Secret Service. So it seems to me, Julian, that journalists, political advisors, and political speechwriters have entered the writing of historical books. Edward Acorn's The Lincoln Miracle, and Sidney Blumenthal's Political Life of Abraham Lincoln, and Ted Widmer's Lincoln on the Verge. What do you find is the draw of writing historical nonfiction? What drew you to not only historical writing, but this particular subject?
Thank you for having me. It's a great place to start. As an investigative journalist, I've always been interested in secrets, in the dark side of society, holding up a dark mirror and maybe making people a little uncomfortable about things that they either thought they knew, and I'm trying to expose a deeper truth. And when I came across some of the shocking truths about Canada's role in the Civil War. I think if any Americans think about Canada during the Civil War, the most you would think about would be the Underground Railroad. Canada, as you know, was the terminus because Canada was part of the British Empire, had abolished slavery. If an escaped enslaved person made it to Canada, they were free. And so we were called the North Star, a beacon of freedom. And that's true, and it's something to be proud of. But what I discovered was really only part of the story. And I wanted to hold a light to some of the darkness that had been hidden for too long.
Well, certainly the slaves and those who wished to be freed made it up to Canada. I guess they understood that the year 1833 existed in the British Empire. That must have had something for them to do. Of course, they also followed the drinking gourd, didn't they? I don't know a North Star song, but I know the drinking gourd song. So let's get into what Canada was at the time and the views of the Canadian populace. In the chapter 3, you write of Canadians rising up to protect a runaway slave from extradition who had murdered his master. But later you write that most Canadians were more sympathetic to the South. So what was the general view of most Canadians to the raging war with slavery down below them? Were they divided as much as Americans were? What were their arguments if they were for the South? What about its different classes? Whom did they support? Give us a broad view of the populace at the time, please.
Well, I think you're right. Canada was divided as the U.S. was divided, and in many ways they were divided along class lines, the elites and the ordinary population. Canada was still a colony. Canada would become an independent country, 1867, just a few years after the Civil War. Now, when the Civil War starts, the Lincoln government was quite outraged when Britain declared neutrality. I mean, think about that, right? You have a legitimate elected government, democratically elected government led by President Abraham Lincoln, and a secessionist slaveocracy in the South. By declaring neutrality, Britain and Canada were basically saying, we're not going to pick sides. And what that meant is that Canada became a haven where Southern spies, soldiers, mercenaries, aristocrats could openly operate in Canada. And what you saw was this divide where many members of the elite are leading politicians, leading church leaders, leading newspaper editors, were very, not necessarily pro-slavery, but viciously anti-Lincoln. He was called in newspapers a mad despot, a mediocre lawyer. The Emancipation Proclamation was criticized in newspapers here as the ragings of a fiend. The Catholic Church supported the South, and many of our elites were making money off of the blockade, and they felt sympathy. So the Canadian elites tended to back the South. Ordinary Canadians, though, in many ways did not. For various reasons, they signed up in tens of thousands to fight on the Union side. So in many ways, the American Civil War spilled over and became a bit of a political civil war in Canada.
Let me ask you a few questions about this. For instance, I know George Jefferson was a good example of his class of the elites, but what did they expect to get out of the support for the Confederacy? Or was it their social alignment with the Southern aristocracy that brought them to the South?
I think there was certainly a class sympathy. The aristocrats who were coming from the South to settle in Toronto and Montreal were high class, well-dressed, well-moneyed, and there was an immediate affinity with people like George Taylor Denison III, one of the wealthiest aristocrats in Toronto, who turned his villa into a refuge for Southern spies and scoundrels. There were economic reasons. 80% of Britain's cotton came from the South, and so they relied on the trade with the South, and they were upset, I think, at a lot of Lincoln's populism and his democratic urgings. So those were some of the reasons, and for the very same reasons, ordinary Canadians sided sometimes for pure economic reasons. Joining the army meant a steady salary, but also they believed in the cause that Lincoln was espousing.
A quick question, very quick on this. Did the Canadians who came down to fight, did they get their bounties? Did they get bounties themselves, even though they were Canadians?
They did well. First of all, many of the Canadians who fought were already living in the States. Hundreds of thousands were living in New York and in the Northeast because of economic conditions. But yes, they would be registered and served as full-blooded soldiers. Many of them earned medals of honor, and some were buried in Arlington. And as we discover in the book, some will play key roles. One of them would land up helping to lead the hunt for John Wilkes Booth. So
Well,
in many
we'll get
ways,
to that.
Canadians were all over the war.
I want to ask you then about the Canadian newspapers. It seems that the majority of them were supporting the Southern cause, and very few, like George Brown's paper, was one of the few that supported the North. Well, if the Canadian populace was so divided, why did so many newspapers go against the populace?
Excellent question. And I think it's because the newspapers were being published by elites. They were clearly back then tied to the major political parties and to the Catholic Church in Quebec. They were very conservative. You know, the Confederacy sent an agent up to Canada to try to look at what popular opinion was. And he reported back that all the newspapers in Canada were on our side, except one. The one, of course, was George Brown, founded the Globe newspaper. It's now known as the Globe and Mail. He was a staunch abolitionist. And newspapers back then wore their politics on their sleeve, right? There was no pretense to objectivity.
Same down here in the States.
He was ferociously fighting the other newspapers. It was shocking. Think about it. Like the weekend that Abraham Lincoln is assassinated and dies, right? Canadians reading most of the newspapers would have read stories saying literally that he had it coming. One of the newspapers said, well, the man who killed Lincoln killed a man who had murdered the US Constitution. You know, that he was a despot. So there was justification for the assassination, not what we imagine today when Lincoln is revered. And I think that's what's important when we look back at history is not to rewrite it the way we want, but to see it for all its ugliness.
Just as an aside, I was in Marietta, Georgia, just up north of Atlanta a couple of weekends ago for a Civil War show. And near the end of it, one of the participants actually came by and saw Abraham Lincoln Bookshop there and came up to me to tell me that Lincoln was a tyrant. So they're still there saying that Lincoln was a tyrant. You know, the statistics were interesting. 29 earned medals of honor of Canadians who came down. 5 became Union generals.
Mm-hmm.
So about how many do you think enlisted on each side, and how many died from them, just generally?
We don't have full numbers because in many ways it was hard to track. People wouldn't always give their birth dates, much less their birthplaces. It's estimated that perhaps as many to 20 to 40,000 Canadians served in the Civil War, overwhelmingly on the side of the Union. There were a few famous soldiers on the Confederate side. It was partly because of geography. It was obviously easier to sign up to the Northern Army. And by some estimates, something like 5,000 to 6,000 Canadians died there. A big part of the Canadians who signed up were the Black Canadians, who were either had been born here, some were formerly escaped slaves, mainly based in Southern Ontario, and they moved down to fight when Lincoln opened up the ranks of the army to Blacks. And there were also 2 doctors from Canada, one American and one Canadian, who and Alexander Abbott, the picture we're now seeing, was the first Canadian-born black doctor. And the minute Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation, he will write a letter. He will get accepted in the army with his companion, Dr. Augusta. And at one point, the two of them will kind of crash a party at the White House and get to shake the hands of Abraham Lincoln, which causes quite a stir. So these are the positive stories that are important to cherish. But it doesn't take away from the fact that Canada, unfortunately, became a haven for millions of dollars of Confederate money and for attacks that we would consider today terrorism.
Positively. Now, the Canadian ports of Halifax and Nova Scotia each supported the Confederacy, just like across the pond in Liverpool, for instance. In their trying to end run the Southern blockade, how successful were they and how did they do that? How did they get the supplies from Canada down to the South?
They were very successful. There was almost a commuter run between Bermuda and Halifax. So Confederates would take a boat from the Carolinas to Bermuda, run at night to try to avoid Union ships, and make it to Halifax. The point about the blockade was important. Lincoln had tried to impose this kind of embargo, this iron curtain, if you will, around the South to try to starve the South of food, supplies, and armaments. And so running the blockade was vital, and they were quite successful by water, but also by land. In my book, I document some of the spies, the couriers, who would be running constantly between Richmond and Montreal. A daring, beautiful woman named Sarah Slater, who would carry messages and important instructions. John Surratt, one of Booth's accused accomplices, was an important courier who moved back and forth. So there was this constant kind of intrigue. At one point, Surratt talks about being in Montreal and feeling safe there as he's hiding out. And Montreal, as I described, became a kind of Casablanca. Right after the assassination, the American authorities rushed to Montreal, but they can't find John Surratt because he will be hidden by the Confederate agents there and by the Catholic Church. So you get the sense of intrigue and also anger by American authorities at what was going on in Canada.
And just to talk about the Casablanca of Canada, Montreal, was there a Rick's?
There was. By the way, I was in Casablanca recently, and I actually went to the Rick's Cafe. Now, of course, it never really existed. It existed only in a Hollywood set, but an enterprising American recreated it, and it's quite a popular bar. But Rick's Cafe during the Civil War was known as Dooley's. Dooley's Bar was in the St. Lawrence Hotel. The St. Lawrence Hotel, I live in Montreal, as you can see from the skyline behind me. And that's a picture of Dooley's Bar, and off to the side was a famous pool room. The St. Lawrence Hall was one of the most luxurious hotels in North America. John Surratt stayed there. This is what the hall looks like. And the building looks much the same. I'm organizing tours of Montreal for visitors, and you could see this building in just a few blocks from where I live. And it looks not unsimilar to what it was like then. John Wilkes Booth, in October 1864, at the time, of course, one of America's most famous actors, but also an avid supporter of the South, and he despises Lincoln. He's already plotting to kidnap Lincoln at the minimum, if not kill him. And he comes where? To Montreal, because he knows that's where a lot of Confederate agents are. That's where he can get help. He stays at the St. Lawrence Hotel. He dines and plays cards with leading Confederate agents. He will go to the main bank in Montreal, a branch called the Ontario Bank, that is holding the equivalent of millions of dollars of Confederate money. And later in the conspiracy trial, we'll find out that they were openly engaged in money laundering. But one night, John Wilkes Booth is at the Dooley's Bar, the Rick's Cafe of Montreal's Casablanca. He's shooting pool. It's 2 weeks before the election in November, where Lincoln is hoping to be reelected. And Booth utters these famous and quite chilling words. He will say that it made damn little difference what would happen in the election. Head or tail, he said, Abe's contract was nearly up. Whether reelected or not, he will get his goose cooked. And of course, looking forward now, those words uttered by Booth in a few months, that's exactly what he will do. So Montreal became an important staging ground for these plots and these conspiracies.
Now we have John Wilkes Booth up there. This is a very rare image. Actually, I don't use rare very often because it seems to me once in a lifetime. This is once in a lifetime. It's a beautiful carte de visite of him here. Let me go before I get to some of the Secret Service, and also after that we'll get to some of the colorful characters and some of the different raids and events that occur. Let's get to that in a moment, but I want to ask about Canada and Great Britain. In 1861, was Canada letting the mothership, Great Britain, decide their policies toward the American Civil War? This is now the government, not the people. Did they actually have the same goals, each government, or was it Canadian government just turning a blind eye to the Southern conspiracies, maybe in revenge for the American Revolution? They let it go. What was the government like? And did they actually fear maybe reprisals from the North, the Union side, which was right next to them?
Oh, they did. It's important to also recognize that there were members of Lincoln's government that were openly annexationist, that called even before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and after the Civil War for either invasions of Canada or at least for annexation. So there were a lot of reasons. And in many ways, the Civil War hastened the creation of Canada as an independent country in 1867. What's important to realize is what we're talking about, where I live now, Canada, America's, no Canada. Canada didn't exist as Canada during the Civil War. They were called the British North America. They were provinces. They were sometimes called Canada West and Canada East. They were colonies of Britain. They were not independent. They had no say over foreign policy. What Britain decided was the law and the rule. Now, different politicians spoke up. That's why we had people like George Brown, who said there's an abolitionist movement in Britain, there should be one here. But Canada had no choice. Canada followed in lockstep what Britain did. And that's what so outraged Lincoln, because he realized that by declaring neutrality, it's one thing for Britain to be neutral, which had a bad impact because London was able to finance the South. But by declaring Canada neutral, Lincoln realized his backyard was suddenly a haven to his enemies, and he lands up in many ways fighting a war on two fronts.
I was just thinking, two-front war. He couldn't do much of that, really. And he also had, by the way, the West,
Absolutely,
the American natives, the Indians, uprising in Minnesota, for instance, and what was happening in Arizona and New Mexico. So there were many fronts that perhaps Lincoln had to fight. Now let's get to the Confederate Secret Service and maybe the finances. Talk briefly about their role in helping Canada and what were the finances they provided, maybe manpower, and also what were the Union countermeasures? If everyone was in Montreal, the Casablanca, if I remember correctly, the Free French and the Nazis were all there. Well, how many Northerners were sitting in that pool room watching Booth at the same time? Give us a little overview of that.
Where was Humphrey Bogart in the 1860s?
Not at the head of Rick's, I bet.
Well, in early 1864, the war is beginning to turn against the Confederacy. They're not losing yet, but they're stopping to win, and the Lincoln's forces are becoming increasingly menacing to southern cities. And so Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, authorizes, there's a secret passage of a bill in the Confederate Assembly, and $1 million back then, which is multi-millions today, is set aside to set up a secret service, and most of that money will go to Canada. He will name two of his close political advisors, former Washington heavyweights, a man named Jacob Thompson and another named Clement Clay. And these two men will make their way to Canada through the route we talked about, through the water up to Halifax and then to Montreal and on to Ontario. And they will deposit up to $649,000 at the time, many millions today, in a bank in Montreal, which will become the major slush fund for Confederate operations. They will use that for propaganda, but they will also use that to launch what, as I mentioned before, what would be considered terror attacks. There was an attempt to set New York ablaze, arson attacks on New York as payback for the scorched earth policies that Union generals were visiting upon the South. There was a plot for bioterrorism we can talk about.
Yeah,
and there
we'll
was
get
a
to that.
famous attack on St. Albans, Vermont. So this money was actively being used,
But
and it was
Julian,
quite open.
let me ask you, was this Confederate currency? I was down, as I said, in Marietta. I tried to tip a waitress for some Confederate currency. It didn't go
work.
through.
It didn't work. No,
Oh.
according to testimony, it was, according to the bank, they said it was American greenbacks. Sometimes it would actually be currency, British currency, because some of the Confederate financing was coming from London. John Wilkes Booth will take out a bank draft when he's in Montreal, and that is the equivalent of $300 in US gold, but it'll be in British pound sterling.
Well, we're going to give away a little bit of the end here because Booth actually was successful in killing Lincoln. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that so early in this talk, but let's talk about two volunteers on the North who actually met near the beginning of the war around First Bull Run. One was Edward Doherty. I happen to have a discharge that he signs for one of his men, and there's Doherty's signature right there at the end. And let's talk about him. He headed up the 16th New York Cavalry looking for Booth. This is later on, and received the largest proportion of the rewards, $75,000. So speak of Doherty, who was a Canadian, of course.
Who was Edward Doherty, was born in a small town in Quebec, not far from where I live in Montreal. Lands up, like many Canadians, working in New York. The Civil War starts, and like many people, he signs up right away without thinking about it. It was not his country, it was not his war, but for whatever reason, a sense of adventure, a sense of cause, he signs up, rises through the ranks very quickly, does have, according to his military record, a drinking problem, other problems, but is cited for his courage and his bravery. And he is sitting on the outside Lafayette Park, right opposite the White House, on the Monday after Lincoln is assassinated, April 1865, and he gets a note to report to the War Department. He shows up, not knowing what the assignment will be, and he's handed two pictures of John Wilkes Booth and his accomplice, David Harrow, and he is named to lead the regiment, the Army regiment, that will hunt down Booth, along with two U.S. detectives. It'll take them 12 days, doesn't take them long, to hunt through the backwoods of Maryland and Virginia. John Wilkes Booth, by the way, will use the information he got in Montreal. He got reference letters for Confederate underground associates, including, according to some historians, Dr. Samuel Mudd. So Booth is hiding with help he got from Montreal. A Montrealer is chasing him for 12 days. They finally catch him at Garrett's farm in Virginia, and Doherty and the others engage in a heated debate with him as he's hiding out in the barn. Doherty succeeds in taking David Harold out, who wants to give in. They set fire to the barn. A shot goes out. Doherty first thinks that maybe Booth has killed himself. He will later find out that one of the soldiers under his command, Corbett, will kill Booth. And as Booth is dying on the porch with Doherty there and the others, he passes away. And what does Doherty find in his back pocket? That bank draft that was signed by the manager, who was a mayor of Montreal and would become a future member of parliament. So you literally have a Montrealer, standing over the body of Booth, who is carrying money from Montreal. And this is all part of that intricate connection Canada had. As the book documents, and people could read more about it, it will take decades for Doherty to get the recognition he felt he deserved because of political machinations.
But he got it fairly quickly, because he actually wrote for 2 newspapers soon after his entry into the war, didn't he?
He did. He wrote for the New York Times and the Montreal Gazette. But then in Congress, when the money was being handed out, much like we see today, there was various backroom maneuverings. So there was a debate over the money, and some unscrupulous politicians who were close to some of Doherty's competitors, the detectives who had been assigned, literally said in Congress outright lies that Doherty had run away. He had, during the confrontation with Booth, he was hiding underneath a shed. And Doherty, of course, was outraged. And it took many years until the New York Times and other historical records set the thing straight. But it just shows you how complicated and how intriguing the myths of history can be.
One of the cartes de visite, the photographs of the day that was used to identify Booth at the Garrett farm, passed through my hands years ago.
Wow.
I was able to have it. It was fascinating to hold that and know that look, the detective and Doherty looked down at Booth with this CDV that I was holding, and it was right there as well. Booth, of course, had been calling Harold a coward as he went out, pushed him out. So Bjorn is with us, and after he has done his work, then I would like to get back to the other Canadian who has a fascinating story. There's so many of them. We won't have time to get to all of them, but to Emma Edmonds. We'll get to her right after Bjorn.
Oh, well, then I'm going to try to move fast, because I want to hear about Emma and all the rest of the really fascinating Canadians. But I do want to send out greetings and thanks to those who are joining us and watching tonight. It's the afternoon where Julian is, and it's about noon where we are. But Dan Madsen is watching from Denver. Good to see you as always, Dan. David Wiegers is here from Gurney, watching from Gurney. And Julian, David is one of the finest scholars of Lincoln sculpture out there. He goes around taking photographs of Lincoln sculptures. And David says, I am always asked if there is a statue of Lincoln in Canada. As far as I know, there are none. There is a statue in Ottawa that is often mistaken as Lincoln, but it's just a Canadian guy with a beard. Fernando Bastidas is watching from Venezuela. In a minute, Julian, if you know about a Lincoln statue in
I don't.
Canada.
I believe he's accurate. I do not know of
Argentina
of a Lincoln statue.
Yeah. But then finally, we do have a question from one of our customers for you, Julian, and it's from Jeffrey Boutwell. And Jeffrey Boutwell has written a biography of his relative, George Boutwell. So I'm sure you've encountered George during your research. Jeffrey says that while George Boutwell was on the Judiciary Subcommittee on Lincoln's assassination in the spring of 1866, he had suspicions that Andrew Johnson and those close to him helped, or at least did not impede, John Surratt's escape to Canada and then to Europe. The theory being that the Johnson folks wanted to put Mary Surratt's hanging behind them. Did you come upon that, Julian? And do you have an opinion on whether Johnson and some powerful people in Washington might have helped Surratt escape after the assassination?
I did come across some of those theories. I personally don't buy into them. And people, of course, can do their historical research and the readings and come to their own conclusions. Part of the problem is that after the Lincoln assassination, the Confederates who stood accused in Canada for collaborating and trying to aid Booth or aiding the assassination, one of the early pieces of fake news, if you want, that they floated right away, literally in days after, was that Andrew Johnson, that, oh, well, look who's the man who stepped into Lincoln's shoes. It was the vice president. So clearly he is the guilty subject. So I think you have to watch carefully, where that leads. The other question is the evidence clearly shows that John Surratt needed no help from officials in Washington. He had made it to Montreal many times with the help of this expert spy named Sarah Slater. He was in Montreal when the assassination takes place on one of his missions. He is sent by a Confederate leader there to look at other missions, including a prison break, reads about the assassination in the newspapers, and his name is named in it. Now, by the way, the night of the assassination, because everybody knows it's Booth, he's well known, right? He's on the stage. It's like Brad Pitt today committing a murder, right?
That's right.
It wasn't a secret, right? The police immediately, the authorities go to Mary Surratt's boarding house, which is known as a Confederate hangout. Booth was known to be there. And they ask where John Surratt says, and she says openly, quite honestly, he's in Montreal. She knows he's in Montreal because that's where he would hang out. Surratt, realizing he's now in danger, is on the run. He hides out first in the St. Lawrence Hotel, the picture we saw, and then with the help of sympathetic Catholic priests, will basically hide in these small Quebec villages all through the summer. Quite amazingly, and he'll admit this later in a speech he makes. And then the Catholic Church in Quebec, realizing that things are getting too hot because police are looking for him. The police know he's in Quebec. At one point, there's even the police and the authorities know the Catholic Church is helping him. The Catholic Church in Quebec will help Surratt make it to Rome and serve in the Pope's private army as a Zouave. And it's only there a year later that Surratt will be arrested. And of course, as people know, he's charged, but he will get acquitted in the trial. So no, I think Surratt had enough help from the Confederate agents that he didn't need any other help.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeff, for that great question.
Great question.
And Dan, I am going to throw this interview back to you so we can find out about some more fascinating Canadians.
Well, I'm going to go back to Surratt for a moment because we happen to have a note written out by William Seward. It's a telegram. And what he's doing now, of course, Surratt had gotten to Rome, as you say, was a papal guard, but he was outed by another guard. Thank you for getting that up. And a man named Henri de Saint-Marie saw him, outed him. Surratt was arrested, escaped to Egypt, and was rearrested.
And another coincidence, by the way, Daniel, is that man, Mr. Saint Marie, who spotted him, was, you guessed it, another Canadian.
Right, exactly. So if you'll put that back up, please, Bjorn. This is before he was brought, Surratt was extradited from Egypt back here. He was put into this, Seward put him in to get him back here, but then decided to wait and crossed his name out and put Saint Marie right above it. So this is really getting Saint Marie so he could come to the trial and testify against Surratt, who would then be on the next boat. So that's kind of an interesting side bar here that we happen to have here. So now I'm going to go back to we have so many characters to go through. people, some of you know the names of some of the people we're going to talk about. Others may not, but even if you know them, there's so much that Julian has gotten into this book, background of who they are, that you're going to want to get to this. This really is a book that has not been done like this before. And because, as we said at the beginning, Julian is a newspaper guy, he knows how to write. And he writes a wonderful narrative. And this will just suck you in and keep you going, just like a film would keep going. So I recommend this as something new in the field. Now, here is a book, The Female Spy, beautiful Victorian cover here. And this is during the war, 1864, that one of your characters, Emma Edmonds, who didn't go under the name of Emma Edmonds in the war, she was a female spy. Now, maybe some of the adventures in here are a little over the top and made up perhaps, but nonetheless, she got a good bonus, I bet, from her publisher in 1864 to write this. So, Julian, tell us of this fascinating woman who's also known as Frank.
Frank, that's right. I loved Emma's story, and it says so much about the war and in many ways the theme of the book, because I think in the end, the book is all about choices and the choices we make and the consequences that has for history. Emma Edmonds is born in the eastern province known as New Brunswick, a farm girl. And she chafes early on as a girl, restricted by all the limits put on women, no jobs, very little education. She escapes from her family farm as soon as she can, and quickly discovers, if you look at how she looks with short hair, and she was rather strong growing up on a farm, she could pass as a man, and she gets work and is quite successful as a Bible salesman of all things. And she lands up in Flint, Michigan when the war breaks out, very successful, known as Franklin Thompson. The war breaks out, and there's this great quote from her in that book you were holding out, where she says, the great question to be decided was, what can I do? What part am I to act in this great drama? And it's a choice that everybody had to make, just as we have to make today, whether it's the war in Ukraine or other burning issues. What role are you going to play? And Emma writes how she says, it's not my country, it's not my war, but I felt called upon to fight for this cause. She is still Franklin Thompson. So she walks into the recruitment office in Flint, Michigan. And back then, frankly, if you had a pulse, you were going to be let into the Union Army. They didn't do much of a medical check, as you can imagine. And for 2 years, she will exist as Franklin Thompson. And she's quite successful as a nurse. She's a field nurse. She doesn't want to be back in the safe quarters. She wants to be in the battles as a nurse. And she will become a mail courier for one of the leading generals. She will witness a lot of battles. And then after 2 years, for several reasons, and I explore in the book how a lot of it could be linked to she falls in love with at least one, if not two men, and that will, of course, lead to complications. She will leave the army, and Franklin Thompson is listed as a deserter. As far as everybody knows, this man named Frank Thompson has deserted. Well, Emma will come out with that book in 1864 that you were showing. Is a huge bestseller. She donates all the money to hospitals and wounded soldiers, and she becomes one of the most famous disguised women in Lincoln's army, but nobody still knows her real name. They know her just as this. She never reveals she was Franklin Thompson. Fast forward to the 1890s. She now wants to get her pension, and she wants to get her record cleared as a deserter, because she's still listed as a deserter. So she approaches some of the men who still only knew her as Franklin Thompson. Lucky for her, one of the men has become a congressman, another has become an influential editor. The men will immediately rally to this woman they always knew as Frank. And through their work, Congress will pass a bill declaring her not a deserter and giving her a pension. And she's even inducted into the Grand Army of the Republic. So she ends up being a hero 30 years after the war. It's a wonderful story.
There are a lot of stories in here. One that I just wanted you to, again, very briefly, because we have so much else to get to, but George Ellsworth, known as Lightning, is an interesting character that comes into the book just a few times, but he seems to be, to me, the first media hacker.
Yes, yes. In many ways, almost the inventor of fake news. It's important to realize how new certain things were. So the telegraph and Morse code had just been invented several years before the war. He was a whiz kid, what we would now have called a nerd, right? As a young teenager, he was a whiz kid on the telegraph. He moves down, I think he's only 14, to work in the South for some of the telegraph companies. And then for a sense of adventure, wants to join what was the equivalent of almost the Navy SEALs or the Green Berets for the Confederacy. They were called Morgan's Raiders, led by John Morgan. And he walks up to John Morgan, a scrawny little Canadian kid, and says, "I'm a whiz at the telegraph. I can help you." Morgan recruits him. And what they would do is, as they were carrying out raids deep into Union territory, he would hack in to the telegraph lines and send fake news, fake messages. Yeah. He would tell them the Confederates are going there when they were going elsewhere. They would play pranks, ordering bottles of booze to be shipped and signing it under the name of Union generals. So he was one of the few Canadians who became famous for helping the South.
So let's go in now. It's kind of a two-pronged thing here. The colorful characters I'm talking about and the various actions taken by some of these characters. Now, Jacob Thompson is a major character throughout the book because he was the head of that Secret Service. And Clement Clay, a little bit to the lesser extent, they weren't very good together as personalities, but it seemed that they worked fairly well. Let's talk about a couple of these people that were under him. One was Bennett Young, and many know about the St. Albans raid, and he had a role there with Sarah Slater as well. But talk about Bennett Young and how did he wind up later on the speaker's stand with Woodrow Wilson?
It's a fascinating story, and it says so much about what the Civil War was really about. As we had talked about in early 1864, the war is going badly for the South. Davis sends two of his political allies with close to $1 million to Canada to set up the Secret Service, but he knows they'll need soldiers. These are politicians. They'll need experienced cavalrymen. And several of Morgan's raiders, as the group we were talking about, the equivalent of the Navy SEALs, the guerrillas for the Confederates, are sent north to Canada, including Bennett Young, handsome, in his early 20s, a divinity student. This is him much older, but when he was young, he was dashing. He could charm the ladies. And the Confederates first start launching raids against the prisons all along the northern border with Canada, where the Confederates are being held in Union prisons, because it's important. The Confederates need the manpower. None of those raids are successful. So Bennett Young approaches the Confederate leaders and says, "I have a much better idea. Sheridan and other Union generals are terrorizing the South, setting our country side ablaze. Let's do the same thing to northern cities." He said he picks a target, and he picks St. Albans. I go down regularly to ski in Vermont, and it's the first town you hit when you cross the border into Vermont from the Canadian side. It's only about 20 miles from the border. He organizes a raid, and what he and 20 of his men will do is they gallop into town dressed as Canadian tourists. He actually visits the governor's mansion and will charm the governor's wife as a divinity student. And then one afternoon, he shows up in the middle of the town square with a gun. Within 15 minutes, his men will rob the banks of something like $200,000, a lot more in money today. They will kill one innocent bystander, and they will flee across Canada. You can imagine the headlines in the papers, right? This was the most northerly attack by the Confederates in the history of the Civil War. And it was clear they came from Canada. Lincoln and his administration was outraged. There was talk of an open invasion into Canada to get these bad guys. They're arrested, they're found quickly, and you think that'd be over. But what I explain in the book, and we don't have to give away too much, but the trial turns out to be an even bigger fiasco. It will lead to the resignation of a Montreal police chief who will be accused of collaborating with these Confederates, allowing them in effect to steal the money a second time. And the newspapers are furious, and Abraham Lincoln, in the last State of the Union address he will give, nobody knows it's the last State of the Union address in December, he will denounce Canada for these attacks and, believe it or not, will impose what we still live with today, passports. When I come to your country, I need the passports. You're right. That's the book that one of the books that Bennett Young writes.
Wizard of the Saddle. And probably I shouldn't be surprised that Woodrow Wilson would have a Southern Canadian Confederate on the stand with him later on during his presidency. I probably should not be surprised.
But doesn't it? It says so much. But Daniel, I'm glad you showed that book. It says so much about the Civil War, because as I point out in the book, the Civil War, as far as I know, is the only war where the losers got to write the history. Traditionally, of course, the victors write history. But what happened with the Lost Cause movement, and Bennett Young represents that, he gets acquitted, he stays in Canada for the duration of the war, will then go back to the States, become a leading member of the Confederate Veterans Organization, will help erect some of the statues we still see today. And as you point out, in 1914, in Arlington Cemetery, they erect, with Woodrow Wilson on the stage and Bennett Young speaking, talking about bygones be bygones, a huge memorial to Confederate soldiers in Arlington Cemetery, where, by the way, those Black doctors and other Black soldiers are still segregated. And that statue openly talks about the lost cause. And I think in many ways, in what's going on in the States today, we're still seeing elements of that lost cause mythology. And so Bennett Young is an important character in the book, because I think it goes to the theme you've been stressing throughout, is that, you know, history is not some dusty thing in the archives. History is vibrant, and it is with us today.
Yes, it is. Another one that I want to kind of have you speak about. I mean, first of all, we were here in Chicago. We were going to be the target of the Northwest conspiracy. Camp Douglas was to be liberated.
Yep.
They didn't make it. And a
They
couple
didn't
other
make it, but
camps
they
as
tried.
well.
That's right. Bennett Young was in Chicago,
Right here.
one of the organizers. They even tried at one point to take over a Union battleship on the Great Lakes and use it to attack Chicago and other cities. And what's amazing about all this is this wasn't secret. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't, this was openly talked about in the newspapers, which is why, the Lincoln administration got so frustrated and furious at Canada being this haven for these terror attacks.
Now Luke Blackburn, there's a character.
Absolutely.
And he had he was going to do something that even many in the South condemned.
That's right.
And that is using plague to destroy the northern populace in
That's
area.
right. You see a picture
not
of
that
Luke
the
Blackburn.
northern populace had not used it against the Native Americans, by the way.
Exactly.
But here was Luke Blackburn trying to do the same, and he was foiled by a guy named Godfrey Hyams.
Yeah, it's a grueling, very scary story. Luke
Let's
Blackburn,
let the book
who you
say
could see
most
on
of
your
it, but give
screen.
us a quick overview.
Yeah, Luke Blackburn, who you could see on the screen, was in Montreal at that hotel we saw earlier. He was playing cards with John Wilkes Booth. He also spent time in Halifax. He was one of America's leading doctors and specialists in the yellow fever. Yellow fever was a deadly plague. It was called the black vomit. Nobody knew where it came from, and they certainly had no cure. He would fight the plague all through the South, and then volunteers to give his time in Bermuda, where a plague breaks out. But nurses begin to notice some strange things. He would gather the soiled clothing and the bed linens from the dying patients, and he carried it away. We later find out that he stuffed 6 trunks of what he thought were infected yellow fever plague clothing, ships it to Halifax, Canada, and from there we'll hire Godfrey Hyams, a poor shoemaker, to smuggle the trunks into the United States, many cities in the Northeast, and even try to ship some of the fancier clothes to Lincoln in the White House.
Yeah.
And his plan, it's bioterrorism, is to
Yeah.
spread yellow fever. Now, what he didn't know, and nobody knew at the time until the 20th century, is yellow fever comes from mosquitoes, doesn't come from clothing. But at the time, nobody knew that. Well, and in fact, there is even a yellow fever outbreak in one of the towns he ships to, so he thinks it's working, and then he plots it again. He will get arrested because Godfrey Hyams never gets paid, and Godfrey Hyams walks into the U.S. consulate in Toronto to kind of spill the goods. He's a poor, shabbily dressed man, and they're not likely to give him much credence. But timing is everything. It's April 7th. A handful of days later, Lincoln will be assassinated. Suddenly, plots against Lincoln and plots by the Confederates are really important. Hyams is now called to testify against the Confederates in Canada and against Luke Blackburn. Guess what happens? Just like with the St. Albans raiders, thanks to Canadian justice, Luke Blackburn will not only get acquitted, he will return to his home state in Kentucky, and I kid you not, he will run and successfully get elected as a governor. And when the northern papers say, wait a minute, isn't that the same Dr. Luke Blackburn who was, behind the black vomit and the yellow fever? Blackburn has the audacity, as does the media who support him, to say that that's not true, that those are preposterous statements. Maybe he wasn't even in Canada during the war. So talk about an early omen of fake news.
Yeah.
And Blackburn becomes a famous and beloved governor in Kentucky.
I still have a few more things to go over, even though we're just right upon our usual time. So we're probably going to go a little bit over.
Sure.
You can even say yes or no to this one. Sarah Slater, whom you mentioned earlier, we didn't go into her as much as you do in the book, but she was a friend of John Surratt.
Mm-hmm.
But was she, do you think, a paramour of John Wilkes Booth?
We don't know.
Just as an aside.
That's right. She was described as beautiful by all the people who saw her, the lady in the veil. She clearly spent a lot of time with John Surratt. The registry at the St. Lawrence Hall shows their rooms. And at some points, John Surratt checks in and she does not. Did she stay with him? There are some authors who say at one point she crossed paths and knew John Wilkes Booth. So we don't know. What's fascinating about her is she's not only one of the leading female spies for the Confederates, but is never caught. She disappears as a good spy would.
Yeah.
And only thanks to some research by some wonderful historians who I quote in the book, do we find out what happens to her. Believe it or not, she actually marries a Union veteran and lives off his pension. And then when she finally passes away, like all good spies, she lies about her birth date and shaves off some years of her life on her tombstone. But she plays a key role in this constant Casablanca mood that was going on in Montreal.
You spoke earlier of Jefferson Davis getting
Hmm.
into Montreal later on, after the war, certainly. A question. How much do you think he knew of all the Secret Service activities in Canada? Was he a part and parcel of that? Did he say, yeah, go do it?
Oh, I think it would be hard for him not to have known. The Secret Service was formerly run by Judah Benjamin, his Secretary of State. Can you imagine today or in any administration that, especially in an embattled Confederacy, for the president not to know what the Secretary of State was doing? Keep in mind, it was Davis himself who personally picked the two leaders of the Secret Service, his close friends, Clement Clay and Jacob Thompson. Even if he didn't know, he'd be able to read about it in the newspapers. The New York Times was talking about the arson raid in New York and blaming it on Canada and Confederate agents. The St. Albans trial was front page news. Absolutely, I think he knew. What's fascinating about Davis, and it says so much about the secret history of Canada, is, as people know, he's of course defeated. He sits in a jail for 2 years and then gets bail in 1867. The night he gets bail, what does Jefferson Davis do for refuge and rest? Does he go to Mobile? Does he go to Mississippi? No, he doesn't go to Memphis. He takes a train straight to Montreal. He comes to Montreal. That's where his wife and his children already are. That's where he knows many of his Confederate supporters are. He's financed by local supporters. He will show up unannounced at a theater that's actually holding a Southern benefit. And when people recognize Davis, now keep in mind, this is 2 years after the assassination. Everybody knows the war was about slavery. The crowd will erupt into 3 cheers. The play stops and the orchestra starts playing Dixie. I mean, this wouldn't happen in New York or Boston or Philadelphia or Chicago, but it happens in my town in Montreal. That's the kind of support that Jefferson Davis has. And then he's called to tour Ontario, and he'll make a speech where he literally says, "May peace and prosperity be forever the blessing of Canada, for she has been an asylum." And his words are so important. "Has been the asylum for many of my friends, as she is now an asylum for me." So there you have it, from the leader of the slave South singing the praises of Canada. And my book started because as a history student way back, I don't want to give away my age, but let's just say it was way back in the 70s. I was walking, I was studying at McGill University, and I was walking in downtown Montreal, and the main department store called Hudson's Bay Department Store is right downtown. And there was a plaque on the wall to Jefferson Davis, and put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And I remember thinking, why is there a plaque for the leader of the slave South in Montreal? And why is it still here? Turns out, as my research uncovered, is that was where he stayed briefly when he was in Montreal. It was the home of a prominent publisher. And it says so much about the history that we don't realize Canada played in your Civil War.
Yeah. Interestingly, after his death, Verena went into New York and lived a long life in New York, made peace with New Yorkers. They made peace with her, and became good friends with many Union ladies there, interestingly enough. I want to go back to the plaque in a moment, but I have one question before that. Again, let's keep this kind of elevator brief. What is your overall assessment of the Confederate operations emanating from Canada? After you've done this book, what is your assessment of them? How successful were they? Were they not?
It's interesting. They were not successful in the sense that they didn't accomplish many of their political or military goals. As you pointed out, in Chicago and elsewhere, they didn't succeed in in liberating any prisoners. In New York, they set fire to hotels, but none of the fires caught the way they wanted. The Yellow Fever plot fizzled because of bad science. St. Albans was an exception. It was a successful bank raid. Numbers point of view, you could argue they failed. Where I think they succeeded is in what any good terror plot tries to do. It's in unnerving your opponents, right? The Lincoln administration was having a tough enough battle winning the battle against the South. Suddenly they have to look over their shoulder at Canada with all these attacks. There was the propaganda effect. These Confederates were making speeches and they were being supported by the elites. So I think, we now know how the Civil War ended, but if you and I had been living in Chicago in 1861, 62, 63, even 64, it wasn't clear what was going to happen. And Canada, I think, or at least the Canadian elites, had their thumb on the scales and on the wrong side of history.
Yeah.
That's what I think is important.
Now, a Canadian died just 2-3 weeks ago, Jamie Robbie Robertson.
Yeah.
Was he part of the band?
That's right. Wonderful,
And
wonderful musician.
he composed a wonderful song that's well known down here.
That's right.
The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down.
That's right.
With the band, Jamie Robertson. He later said, I know at the time it seemed strange that somebody from Canada would be writing this Southern anthem. It took someone from the outside to really see these things. Well, so my question is, you were showing talking about the plaque. Here it is being taken down, but here we are, a 21st century guy writing an anthem that he thinks is really how things are seen. So are there still Southern sympathizers in Canada today?
I think there are. Now, you have to, I think, to be fair to both Robbie Robertson, look, Joan Baez, a well-known progressive folk singer, does a wonderful rendition, as people know, of that song, right? It's one of my favorite songs. Now, you could argue if you...
But Lincoln had Dixie immediately during the war, still before his assassination. He had... That's right. We can take in
and also if you listen to that wonderful song, it's not about the Southern cause or slavery. It's about a poor man, a soldier, and on both sides of the war, poor men were being exploited and used as cannon fodder. So I don't think Robbie, as a great musician, had sympathy for the Southern cause. But what I do think you're bringing up is if you look at the political debates going on right now, as a journalist, I don't take political stands, but if you look at, there are political forces in the States who are doing exactly what the United Daughters of the Confederacy did. That plaque in Montreal, in my city, was put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. You could see their name in that plaque. They are a group that were formed in 1894, and their specific purpose was to rewrite history. They literally wrote guidebooks telling teachers what books to take out. Does that sound familiar? What things to say about Black history and what not to say. To talk about how slavery was good. They exalted the Klan. They helped contribute, to the famous movie Birth of the Nation. And then they put up this plaque in my city, and they continue today with that propaganda. So the issue of the lost cause, look at the debates going on in your country, as you know, over the renaming of military bases. There are some candidates for the Republican Party who have openly vowed that if they win, they will rename the bases back to the Confederate names that it had. So it shows how the Civil War is still with us. That plaque was taken down, and I think it should have stayed there with an explanation.
I was going to ask you about that because the statues, we have that whole debate here about statues coming down, whether they should or not. What about that plaque to you?
I think the plaque could have stayed there with an explanation saying Jefferson Davis, the leader of the slave South, was housed here in Montreal, and the elites, there's a way to use it as, President Obama used to call it a teachable moment. Yeah. I don't think we should hide the dark past of our history. The point is not to make these Confederates heroes, but to use it as a historical precedent. Now, what happened with that plaque, believe it or not, is I worked, as you pointed out at the beginning, for many years at CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and I was in Toronto at the time. And when a lot of the statues were coming down in your country, I called my daughter, who was working at CBC Montreal at the time, and said, you know what? When I was a student, there was a plaque to Jefferson Davis. I wonder if it's still there. Well, CBC went down, looked at it, and the Hudson Bay Company took it down that day. That's the photo in the book. So I played a role in the taking down of the plaque. But the point is not to hide our history, not to hide our ugly past, but to write about it and to learn the lessons. You know, there was a little known senator running for president in your country in 2008, and he quotes William Faulkner in one of his speeches, and the famous quote that everybody knows where Faulkner says, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." And of course, that man was Barack Obama, somebody I think Abraham Lincoln would have been proud of. Abraham Lincoln, by the way, who famously said, "History is not history unless it is the truth." Well, I think those words are where we could end, because that's what history has to be about, this constant search for the truth, and not to whitewash, to glamorize our past, be it in your country or in mine.
Well, that's a good ending, although I'm going to put a coda on that the hotel where the plaque was is no different than a battlefield down here where we have Confederate monuments, and it is actually a structure from the time. It's not like putting up something in a square somewhere or on something that was there and taken down. It was there. It's a real building, a real historical monument. And I agree with you. It could have been there, left, because that's where Jeff Davis and others were, where things happened. And we could then, as you say, put another plaque up and explain it all. Well, this was a great time with you, Julian. I enjoyed this, and I enjoyed the book because I learned so much. I knew some of these people, George Sanders and others who we haven't spoken with. I've known of them, but now I know a great deal more. And the North Star is something I think many of you are going to enjoy the read besides learning history.
Thank you so much. And people can visit my website. It's my name, juliansher.com. And there's lots of interviews and articles that people could read at their pleasure. And of course, I encourage them to drop by your wonderful bookshop.
Appreciate that. And if you're watching this on our YouTube channel or afterward, even on our website, you can still order as long as we have first editions, but we'll have the book and we'll have books for you to order, and we'll have our famous book plates specially made, placed in there, signed by Julian. So the book is still going to be relevant on into the future. So thank you again, Julian, and all of you for watching A House Divided.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you, Dan, for doing the outro that I normally do. So I don't have anything else to add. This has been Bjorn Skaptason with Daniel Weinberg, Julian Sher. See you next time on A House Divided.